This program has been brought to you in part by Pacific Auction Companies. More information at 303-772-7676 or pacificauction.com.
Good day and welcome everyone to this meeting of the 5 Points Club. As all of you know, my name is Ernest Bollier. Will everyone please give a warm thanks to our hostess for the day, Mrs. Margaret Brown. Mrs. Brown, I'd like you to meet our members of our club who come here every week and talk about the issues of the day. Please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Oh, I'm so pleased to have you here in my lovely home, Mr. Bollier. You know, well, really, I don't need much of an introduction anymore because of some recent events, but I grew up in Missouri. My parents were Irish immigrants, moved to Leadville when I was a young girl, got married to J.J. Brown, a mining engineer. He made us a fortune. We moved down here, built this lovely home, and I'm so glad to have you here.
Well, it's a beautiful home, and we're so happy to be here. Hobart.
Mrs. Brown, I'm Hobart Drizzlewitt. I am the assistant architect of the new golf course that's being built at City Park. It's going to be the first golf course in Denver for the middle class, for those of us who were rejected by the Denver Country Club.
Well, Mrs. Brown, good day to you. My name is George Creel. I'm currently the police commissioner for Denver and was appointed after we successfully routed Robert Spear's machine out of City Hall, finally. So it's good to be here in your home.
Mrs. Brown, I'm Mrs. Gertie West. It's an honor to meet you. I am a native of Denver. I traveled east, as you would like to do, I'm sure. I traveled east, and I received 2 master's degrees from Cornell University, and I am now back. I teach government at the University of Denver, and I am president of the Colorado chapter of the Women's Progressive League.
Well, with Mrs. Brown joining our group today, I thought it would be fitting for us all to talk quickly about the sinking of the Titanic earlier this year and what it has meant for both Great Britain and America. Mrs. Brown, can you tell us about your tragedy and your ordeal?
Well, you know, I'd been in Egypt, and so the beautiful bust of Nefertiti, they just found this year, by the way, lovely. And my grandson here was sick, so I decided I would try to get up on the Titanic. Got one of the last rooms on the Titanic. It was a beautiful ship, but when it hit that iceberg, I was lying in my bed, reading, thrown to the floor, walked out, and the place was chaos. I have to say the men really had no idea how to organize things. Went back to my room, got a lot of clothes, got some money, got some jewels, fortunately. I had plenty of those, and went and tried to do as much as I could to get people organized. I did wind up in one of the lifeboats. The men told me I had to get on. They set those lifeboats off with maybe a third of the people that could have held 67, I think. They held terrible. They didn't know what to do. I wound up teaching the women how to row, giving away all my clothes. I did keep my corset on and an extra layer. Don't believe in what you read. And we rowed and rowed through the night. And fortunately, then the Carpathian came and picked us up, rescued us. But the tragedy continued. I mean, these poor women, many of them immigrants, lost their family, lost their children, lost their husband, lost their way of life, couldn't speak. I speak several languages. I'm not as educated as you are, but I was able to help them out, raise some money, and we hope a tragedy like this never occurs again, but it is ongoing.
It's interesting. Some of the initial reports we heard, people didn't understand the gravity of the situation. Some people were having snowball fights on the upper decks with the snow that had broken off from the iceberg, apparently.
Well, and it's true. We were told that we could be fine, go back to our room, go about our business, but clearly, very early on, you could tell there were severe problems, and that the lifeboats weren't lowered, that there weren't enough lifeboats, there weren't enough life jackets. And of course, the water was incredibly cold. People were plunging off the decks. It was an amazing tragedy.
Just terrible.
Well, you know, as they say at the gatherings of Denver's Sacred 36, Maggie Brown is a wonderful storyteller, even for the parts that are true.
Well, Mrs. Brown, you got me thinking of Nefertiti's bust. I'll tell you what, I think that, see, these experiments with aviation and air travel, that's the key to crossing the North Atlantic. I think if we could train people to fly their own airplanes, we might be able to get to Europe and back without having to use a ship, and without crossing the iceberg field.
Well, it would certainly be drier.
Yes, it would.
Even if we are able to achieve something as fantastical as that, Mr. Creel, I have no doubt that the powers of capital would try to harness that for their own private profit. And Mrs. Brown, I am so grateful that you have survived your ordeal, but I'm hoping, particularly considering your very humble origins, that you will be inspired to work for political and economic and social justice for the dispossessed in America, particularly in memory of those immigrants who died in steerage.
Well, and I actually have been doing that for many years, but we'll get into that as I'm sure as this meeting progresses.
Absolutely. Let's move on to that right now. Mrs. Brown, we here in Denver all read about your work translating for the poor immigrant survivors of the Titanic tragedy. This gives us an opportunity to discuss where some of those poor souls were from. Countries in Europe going through great unrest. We've heard about problems in the Balkans, and closer to home, there is still revolution in Mexico, and U.S. Marines are being sent to the banana republics in Central America. How do you think all of these troubles in the world will affect us here in Denver, Colorado?
Well, I certainly hope the troubles in the rest of the world make all of us here in Denver more aware of the greater world that we live in. You mentioned the Denver 36. I know certainly before this Titanic episode, I was shunned by society, and you know what? I have to say, good riddance to them. Who needed them? When you see all the very, very interesting people doing incredible things in this city. Judge Ben Lindsay working with the juveniles, I've worked with him. You know, I ran for the State House in 1901, and I ran for Congress in 1909. I believe it's very, very important that we get out there and make a better world. Certainly the situation in Mexico is frightening, and in the Balkans, absolutely bad, but we need to travel the world. We need to learn our lessons from these other countries.
Hobart.
Well, I guess, Mrs. Brown, I would say we ought to stay away from the rest of the world, and that's fine if you and the Astors and the rest of high society want to go over and consort with those Europeans, but we should remember what President Washington said, which is to steer clear of foreign entanglements. There's another war starting up in the Balkans between Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire, and nobody knows which one is going to have the worst and most incompetent army, but I guess we'll find out. And that's the fourth war we've had down in that miserable peninsula just in the last few years, with all these ridiculous countries like Montenegro and Greece and Serbia, and who knows, that could turn into some kind of broader war. And you know what I worry about? I worry about these progressives trying to put Theodore Roosevelt into the presidency, because that man is a warmonger. He wants to be like Napoleon and die on the battlefield, and regardless of who starts the war and whether Bulgaria is winning or the Ottomans are winning, he would try to get us into that war one way or the other just for the sake of war. I say we stay out. Let the Mexicans have their miserable revolutions. Let the people in the Balkans fight among themselves. We stay out of it and stay at peace.
Mr. Creel, let's talk about U.S. Marines in Central America, Nicaragua, Honduras, Cuba. What's going on?
What's going on is dreams, visions of U.S. world empire, global empire, replacing the colonial powers of the 19th century with an American colonial empire of the 20th century. And I think, Mr. Drizzlewit, that you're absolutely right. and that's why we need to back Governor Wilson in this year's election. Governor Wilson will keep us out of world entanglements. That's what he's running on, and that's what I believe, and that's why I support Governor Wilson in this election. But right here in Denver, you asked, sir, right here in Denver, we have a group of men, Republicans mostly, fresh back from their adventures in the Philippines War, who would like to extend this. We have people who are running weapons to Pancho Villa and to other militants down in Mexico to feed that revolution down there, hoping that we can take over even more banana republics. And I'm against it. I'm very much against it. I think a lot of that is headquartered right here in Denver.
Gertie, why shouldn't we be exerting our sphere of influence wherever we can at this point?
Oh, for goodness sake, isn't Guam or the Hawaii, the Philippines enough? I really do agree with Mr. Creel. This is the United States feeling its strength in trying to replace these dying European powers and to become the imperial power of the 20th century. And I might add, since none of you have added this, that you'll notice the color of the skins in all these places. You know, we are talking about the United States exerting its strength over peoples of color, the colored people of the world. The United States has no business going hither and yon. We have enough problems right here. And Mr. Creel, I must disagree with you, or was it Mr. Drizzlewood, about Mexico? In part, we have this uprising because it was the United States Capitol exerting its influence, and we had the peasants of Mexico rising up and saying, no, enough of colonial dominance.
Correct.
Well, let's talk about the exercise of influence in our own city. The spirit of unrest has also taken hold of our fair city. On June 1st, 8 years of malfeasance and moral decay came to an end as Boss Spear and his Big Mitt were finally kicked out of City Hall. Our new mayor, Henry J. Arnold, the former County of Denver tax assessor, has promised to bring about a referendum on commission government. The proposed measure would radically alter the current city charter and replace the 16 aldermen serving as city council with 5 commissioners. Mayor Arnold has promised to resign when the commission takes power. Will this be enough to clean up years of corruption? Sir.
No, it will not be. And first of all, I'd like to say something good about Mayor Spear. There's no question that when Arnold was the assessor, he found all kinds of corruption and shady dealings of giving low real estate taxes to Spear's friends and higher ones to his enemies. But the fact is, a lot of what Spear did was good, and it will benefit the city for a century or 3 centuries to come. The beautiful parks being built around the Civic Center, City Park itself, which is going to have a new golf course. So much of what Spear did really benefited the city. I'm sorry he did it in such a dishonest way. But here's and apologies to you, Mr. Creel, but here's the problem with this whole progressive reform is they say, oh, we're going to get rid of the city council and replace it with commissioners. Well, that's still people you're electing, and they're still people who are subject to all the vices of human nature. And likewise, instead of having a mayor, we're going to have a city manager. And the progressives have this conceit that you can just run government like a business, and all you have to do is make these decisions about how to do things, and there's always one right answer that's the smart one, and you just have the system in there to do that. Well, the fact, this is why the progressives are so wrong in their disregard and hostility to our United States Constitution, which understands the eternal foibles of human nature. You don't think that you're just getting some new managers or a new system of management is going to fix everything. You set power against power, check ambition against ambition. What we need is something like to continue with the assessor system, where you have somebody like the assessor, Mr. Arnold, who can uncover the corruption of the mayor. That's the only solution, not these redrawing of lines on some organization box.
It's a good point, and Mr. Creel, I know you put your faith in this new government, but isn't there a good point to be made in the notion that a group of commissioners might be too many cooks in the kitchen?
Well, no, I'll tell you what, the key to it is, and you're right, when Mr. Arnold was in the assessor's office and uncovered a lot of this corruption, you saw what happened down at the big City Hall war when they tried to force him out of his office. I'll tell you what, it's going to take a while. It's going to take a while. The real problem wasn't necessarily the structure. The real problem was that Mayor Spear, or as I called him when I was at the Rocky Mountain News, I called him Robus Spearus, right? I'm the one that named him that. He's loaded up the city payroll with all of his cronies. It's going to take a long time to get these patronage positions out of the city government and to run it like an honest enterprise. It's going to take a while to do that, but we're off to a good start. It's just been a couple of months. Give us some time.
Gertie.
This inglorious corruption that has happened at cities all across the nation.
We're gonna clean it
Well, for goodness sake, this would be the first time we can go all the way back to the original Tammany Hall. You've got this inglorious connection with, you have the city government, you have their rich businessmen who keep them in power. We're talking William Gray Evans, of course, Walter Cheeseman and their cohorts, and then of course they develop their political power by appealing to the poor, honest, but drinking man. It's a story as old as time. And even if we do get this commission, and you are to be commended, George Creel, but even if we do, the power of capital, the power of capital is just too powerful. I would not write Mr. Spears' epitaph. I do believe he is going to have a second act.
And Gertie, you brought up an excellent point when you mentioned appealing to men. Why aren't there women being elected? Why don't women have the vote across the country? You know, there was a suffrage meeting in New York shortly after the Carpathian arrived. Thousands of women marching in the streets.
And a number of men also.
Not enough.
I attended that suffrage march.
Not enough, and Colorado should do more to push this. You know, Colorado was the first state to give women the right to vote.
Absolutely.
And we could be leaders in this. Let's throw all the bums out.
We support you. We support you all the way.
Please join the National Women's Progressive League. We need you.
Let's move on to our next topic. As all of you know, the reform movement began in 1904 when a group of influential citizens dedicated themselves to ending the reign of Boss Spear. At the heart of this group was journalist and our new police commissioner, George Creel, who joins us here today, of course. Commissioner Creel, your decision to take nightsticks from Denver police has caused dissension in the force, but has been applauded by many citizens after years of beatings and deaths in police custody. Stories have been circulating that some smaller members of the force are now being beaten by citizens. Equally controversial has been the commissioner's decision to close Denver's brothels. He proposes to rehabilitate and re-educate those women who cannot be sent back to their families by sending them to the county poor farm for training. What will be the long-term impact of these efforts, sir?
Well, I think the long-term impact is that Denver is going to be known far and wide as a city to do business, as a clean city, as a sober city, and a city that you want to raise your family in. Let me start with the houses of prostitution up in Henderson, where we have the poor farm. Excellent facility for re-educating and reinserting these women back into Denver society. Now let me move on to the police. I think that what you'll see over time is, remember, a lot of these are Spears appointees, people who got on because of their relatives on the force already. The citizens of Denver were sick and tired of the beatings by the police. We had to do something. The fact that the public supports this move shows that it is going to take root and last a long time.
But Mr. Creel, Commissioner Creel, aren't you putting officers in danger by taking away their nightstick?
But they still have their guns when they're in mortal danger. But the fact is, those billy clubs have been used much too freely. And the fact that the public supports this move shows that it's the right way to go.
Ma'am.
For goodness sake, why focus on the billy club? Why focus on the baton? After you take it away, you'll still have the police mentality. We need to professionalize the police force. We need to professionalize the police force and insist on a degree, not some of these doctored high school degrees that many of these men, and you know, that's always who you know, that many of these men show up with. And it just shouldn't be men, by the way, it should also be women, but we need to professionalize. If we can't demand a college degree out of these men and women, hopefully, we at least should demand a police academy. That is real change. As for the brothels, Mr. Creel, you know as well as I that reformers for at least 100 years have been trying to close houses of ill repute. And I understand that you lay responsibility on the men who frequent these fallen women, but we really have to go after the men and their wanton appetites.
Mrs. Brown, what if these women don't want to go to the poorhouse to learn some trade?
I think we should be giving them other options. You know, I helped build bathhouses here, public bathhouses, because these poor women, many of them have come from other countries, many of them have come from the rural areas. They don't have opportunities. And Mr. Creel, if I had a billy club, I might take it to you right now, because I understand you've been spreading rumors that I was using my summer house down on South Wadsworth as a house of ill repute, which I categorically deny.
Well, we'll be investigating that straight away then.
Sir.
Instead of this progressive fantasy here, let's talk about some realistic facts. First of all, prostitution's been with mankind ever since, as long as history's been around. The next thing, maybe the mayor and the police commissioner are going to say, we won't have any more hobos in Denver either. As long as you're going to have a city, you're going to have this. If there's women who want to get out of that business, that's fine, and good for giving them the help. But the fact is, they're not all these little lambs who are white slave victims like you have these stories told. Mrs. Brown, you know from the mining camps, there were plenty of women who went up there, worked in that business for 3 or 4 years, made some money and moved on, and some people choose to do that. I don't think we can pretend that we're going to, in the 20th century in Denver, suddenly change 10,000 years of human nature.
Mr. Drizzlewood, I protest your reference to white slavery. We are talking about the oppression of women and young women, sometimes even girls, of all colors and sadly of all ages. I will repeat, I do believe we have to go after the men who decimate their families and decimate the lives of these women and young girls, and not just write it off as, well, men will be men.
We're doing that. We're going to do that. And let's get together after this meeting. We'll talk about your plan for professionalizing our police department.
Let's move on to the next topic. This year, we have seen one of the most contentious presidential contests in our nation's history. President Taft has managed to retain the Republican nomination despite a vigorous primary contest from former President Teddy Roosevelt, with whom Taft served as Secretary of War. Roosevelt now leads the Progressive Bull Moose Party. The party's platform appears to be pushing the Democratic candidate Woodrow Wilson further left. He is starting to sound a bit like a socialist candidate, Eugene Debs. How will the fracturing of the Republican Party impact the November elections? Ma'am.
Come November 6th, it's going to be President Woodrow Wilson, and that is a fact that disturbs me greatly. He is a Southern man, after all, and if elected, I do believe he's going to be our first Southern president, if I'm not correct, since the Civil War. I do believe Woodrow Wilson will be bad for this country. On the other hand, Mrs. Brown, you were concerned about female suffrage. I do believe, since it's going to be President Wilson, that he will be convinced, as Theodore Roosevelt has already been convinced, that suffrage for women is the right thing to do. It is the American thing to do. But I do fear, no matter whoever gets in, unless it's Eugene Debs, and we know Eugene Debs will not make it to the White House, we are going to have more of this infernal adventurism on the part of the American government.
Mrs. Brown, your thoughts?
Well, with these 3 candidates, I have to say I admire Teddy Roosevelt's spirit. I've always enjoyed his company, and the fact that he agrees women should have the right to vote, I'd like to give him another chance.
Mr. Drizzlewood.
Well, one thing I've always liked about President Roosevelt when he was there, and now President Taft, like me, they're both members of the National Rifle Association, and they've taken a great leadership role in making sure that there are as many schools as possible in America have shooting ranges so that our young boys can learn about riflery and marksmanship and those wholesome values. But I have to say, even though Roosevelt was a good president, he's turned into a megalomaniac, wanting to come back and have a 3rd term in office. Washington set the right example. Nobody should serve more than 2 terms. And as for Wilson, I'd have to agree with Mr. Creel. He's been a good governor of New Jersey, but that's only been for 2 years. And you know why he ran for governor of New Jersey? Because he'd been president of Princeton University for 10 years, and they were getting ready to throw him out. So if we were only going to elect the fellow for 2 years, maybe that would be okay. But I'm not sure how he's going to wear on the country over the long term.
All right. Commissioner Creel?
Well, Mr. Drizzlewood, I think you're wrong about Teddy Roosevelt. He's not turning into a megalomaniac. He is, and he's long been a megalomaniac, and he well deserves it. I met with him back in Khartoum when I was out with Frederick Bonfils of the Post. Left me high and dry there, by the way. But it's past Teddy's time, and I think it's time for Woodrow Wilson. William Jennings Bryan, no less a man than William Jennings Bryan, the great commoner, is in line to be his Secretary of State. They will keep us out of these European, Central American, and other international adventures.
We have to adjourn our meeting in just a couple of minutes, but I wanted to give everybody a chance to talk about the disgrace of the week as they see it. Mrs. Brown.
Well, you know, I have to say, Mr. Creel, the only place I agree with you is getting out of journalism. I have noticed in the extensive coverage of my experience, the journalists so rarely get things right, and I see that things will just continue. Crazy rumors going around about me for decades to come. They'll probably change my name to Molly. They'll probably make a horrible motion picture of my story. I just think the truth is a very valuable thing.
All right. Sir.
both Wilson and Roosevelt for their constant attack on the independent judiciary. The fact is, judges are supposed to be part of the checks and balances against the excesses of the mob and of the moment. And that's why I'm voting for Taft, because even though he hasn't been a very good president, he's the only one of the candidates who really likes the Constitution.
Sir, about a minute left in our meeting.
Robert Speer and his big mitt. For 2 years, since Senator Hughes died, we have had one senator in the U.S. Congress because the Republicans have teamed with Speer and his Democratic machine to keep us from filling that vacancy.
And ma'am.
Massachusetts, after for so many decades oppressing so many young women in their textile mills, the state legislature of Massachusetts has passed the country's first minimum wage law.
Very quickly, something nice.
Walk out of this home and over to Civic Center Park, which is taking shape right now. 100 years from now, I'm sure it will be a jewel of this city.
Jim Thorpe, the great athlete, an Indian, who at the Stockholm Olympics won the decathlon, now the greatest athlete in the whole world.
Splendid.
Oliver Fritchie and his electric car, it won't be long before the internal combustion engine is dead and gone.
I am so sorry, Mr. Bollier. I must have been confused. I'm saying something nice about the Massachusetts state legislature for passing the nation's first minimum wage law. And my disgrace is this continual foreign adventurism on the part of the federal government.
Okay, and the great baseball player Cy Young has retired. Well, the time has come. Our weekly meeting has come to an end. On behalf of the entire 5 Points Club, again, Mrs. Brown, welcome to this great organization. I think we can expect wonderful things from you in the future, and we all look forward to more informative discussions. Thank you all for being here.
This program has been brought to you in part by Pacific Auction Companies. More information at 303-772-7676 or pacificauction.com.